The China and Africa podcast is brought to you in partnership with the Africa-China Reporting Project at Wits University in Johannesburg. The ACRP promotes balanced, considered reporting on Africa-China relations through innovative training programs held throughout the year. More information at africachinareporting.co.za.
Hello and welcome to another edition of the China in Africa podcast. I'm Eric Olander, and as always, I'm joined by Cobus van Staden, the senior China-Africa researcher at the South African Institute of International Affairs in Johannesburg, South Africa. A very good afternoon to you, Cobus.
Good afternoon.
Cobus, last month we were reminded of the security challenges that confront Chinese companies and the Chinese presence in Africa as a whole when three miners or workers, Chinese workers, were kidnapped in Nigeria's Osun state. And it's interesting because Nigeria has become an emerging epicenter of kidnappings and piracy and just general kind of the small-scale terrorism that we're seeing, not just because of Boko Haram, but lots of other factors are coming into play. Earlier this summer in Edo State, that's in southern Nigeria, back in July, more kidnappings of Chinese workers happened there. And that, again, it brings up this issue of, as we see Chinese kind of spanning out into larger and larger parts of Africa, all for the most part, unsecured in that sense, the demand for security and private security is no doubt going to be going up. And that's what we're going to be talking about today.
Yeah, this is a really important issue, not only from the Chinese side, where, working in countries with informal economies and, institutions that are occasionally, not 100% coherent, that's one big problem for on the Chinese side. But on the African side, you're also dealing with security for Africans, including how foreign security companies working for foreign companies are supposed to be interacting with local law enforcement and the police and the army and the government, and that puts a lot of Africans potentially in crossfire situations, raising a lot of not only human security issues but even geopolitical issues as well.
And it's interesting because this is also part of that discussion about the Chinese learning curve in Africa, where, again, they haven't been there for very long. Let's say the current wave is 10 to 15 years of their engagement. But Western organizations, U.S., European, and to some extent the Japanese, have been there much, much longer and have learned how to do this. So when I was living in the Congo, we worked with the G4S, which is a very well-known private security company. And just the whole routines of security were something that were well-established and deeply ingrained in NGOs, in government, in foreign stakeholders in Africa. It's still relatively new for the Chinese, and they haven't felt they needed it for a long time, but that is now starting to change, as we've seen. So we had the opportunity to speak with one of the world's leading experts on this, and there are not many. It's very interesting because in China, and it's hard for people who are not there to understand how difficult it is to penetrate the worlds of security, the military, the PLA, and in these foreign policy circles, particularly today, as China becomes increasingly inward focused and more suspicious of outsiders. So Dr. Alessandro Arduino is the co-director of the Security and Crisis Management Program at the Shanghai Academy of Social Sciences, and he is one of truly the few foreigners who is able to see inside this world. He recently completed a research project with the China-Africa Research Initiative at Johns Hopkins University, where he traveled to Djibouti as part of a broader look at the growing presence of Chinese private security companies in Africa. Unfortunately, Cobus, you weren't able to join us for the discussion, but I had a really fascinating discussion with him, and we started with the recent kidnappings in Nigeria as a good case study for what the Chinese are confronting in Africa. A few weeks ago, there were three Chinese miners who were kidnapped by attackers in Nigeria's Osun state. And it brings up again the vulnerability that the Chinese have by being present in a lot of places where other investors won't go. What is the need, in your assessment, based on the fact that more and more Chinese do seem to be coming under attack or being kidnapped or having problems in volatile places? How would you state the need for Chinese private security contracting forces in places like Africa?
Yeah, as you mentioned, that's exactly one of the main reasons for the existence of Chinese private security. In this respect, when China started to envision the Belt and Road, with President Xi announcing it in 2013, not many projects were already on the ground. But now, 2019, we are seeing that there are a lot of projects already moving from blueprint to realization in areas that are subject to weak state control. In several parts of Africa, the interaction between China and Africa, not only in economic or military term, let's say, require a complex equation that the private security company variable is quite important into that. Let's say, as you mentioned, kidnap for ransom is a big problem, not only in Africa, but in several other parts of the BRI that range from Pakistan to even South America. And in this respect, the risk assessment and mitigation provided by private security, all together with international and Chinese insurance company, are an integrating part of the security need of the BRI. These, let's say, in the African continent, differentiate quite to the other part of the BRI in which the Chinese private security are called to protect Chinese interests. In this respect, in Africa, there is, let's say, need for a new kind of security, conflict resolution, and economic development that move the idea of private security from the precedent private security that in the 60s were, let's say, operating in the African continent. And I'm referring to the mercenary stigma that is still there since the post-colonial conflict. In this respect, Chinese companies are a newcomer, and they are trying to speed up their effort in protecting the Chinese worker in the area. In some area, there are high risk, as you mentioned, the kidnapping of the 3 Chinese workers, as it happened in the past, even before the BRI in Africa. And this is quite a new thing, considering the fact that China has been in Africa for quite a long time. And at the time, from the 70s, up to now, basically, Chinese were organizing themselves with local militia to protect themselves. Now the market for force is evolving, is growing bigger, and there are more professional companies, and among these, of course, Chinese PSC cooperating with international private security companies.
Yeah, let's talk about, just define our terms here. When we talk about a Chinese private security contractor here, what immediately comes to mind for me is the American the former Blackwater Frontier Advisors. These are the kind of famous American private security contractors of ex-military guys. They're big buff. They're wearing black. They're decked out. They've got earpieces. They mean business. These are the guys, the mercenaries that went to war in Iraq and things like that. Is that the same kind of thing we're talking about when we talk about Chinese private security contractors as well?
No, it's quite different. As I was mentioning before, China private security company are involved in protecting asset and personnel from Chinese state-owned company and Chinese private security company. So we are talking about private security, not private military. Let's say the differentiation between private security and private military is still a thin gray area, and you can switch from one to the other quite easily, but definitely private military means that a company is engaging in active kinetic action. So was some of the case, as you mentioned, with Blackwater, but not all, because also Blackwater was providing security for the United States Foreign Service, for example, in a passive stance. While private security are just passive guarding, a case of Chinese is guarding personnel infrastructure, or protect VIP against kidnap and ransom, or protecting vessel against pirate. As I mentioned before, one of the peculiar dimensions of the African continent is the fact that it still carries the stigma of the post-colonial conflict. During the time, let's say the Blackwater of the time was a company called Executive Outcome that was extremely famous, or infamous if you want to say, because it was operating with a small number but highly trained, heavily armed mercenary in support of local government to quell internal problem or external problem. They were heavily armed. They were even operated a Russian attack helicopter, a Mi-24, and at that time, all the focus up to now was on this kind of company. But then, during my research, I came in contact with an expert of the time, Sean Clearly, and in his previous paper, he mentioned that the EO, executive outcome, or other company like Sandline, or now the one that you referenced, Blackwater, that is no more existing with that name, it was just a few of private military company among the hundreds of private security companies that were operating just in passive capacity as a guard. And if we move from the 60s to the 90s, and if we go to, for example, Angola alone, there were hundreds of private security companies. Now, for example, high-level private security company in Africa can be found in South Africa, who have thousands of companies, and hundreds are already operating outside South Africa and all over the continent.
So at for example, at a CNOOC or a China National Petroleum Corporation, CNPC facility in, say, South Sudan or Mali, one would expect there to be some security there around the facility to prevent either some of the instances that have happened in other countries where there are terrorist attacks, or as you've talked about, the capturing of high-level individuals. Should we assume that outside of a CNPC facility in South Sudan, that those would be private Chinese security contractors, armed and trained?
Let's say, first of all...
just as an example.
Operate not only with Chinese, but with international company that can range from G4S, Control Risk, DynCorp, and so on. Then there is another question of what the Chinese private security company can do by law, by the Chinese law outside China, is the fact that technically they cannot carry weapons. So they are a security manager that are in between armed personnel. These armed personnel can be former Western Special Forces ranging from SAS to SEAL or whatever, or local armed militia coming from the army, from the police, that are subcontracted by the Chinese private security company. So it depends a lot on the law of the country, on the maybe sometimes the lack of law in the specific country, and to the fact that only few Chinese companies have the authorization to carry weapons outside China. As I was mentioning before, one of the few cases is in East Africa in anti-piracy convoy protecting mostly CNOC vessel and vessel that carry oil and gas to China against pirate. That's one of the few cases that the Chinese contractor can be armed. Otherwise, basically, they are security manager in between the armed guard and the Chinese company who contract them.
That's very interesting that the Chinese law does not allow for people to carry weapons outside of the country. I know that inside China, there are obviously very, very tight gun control laws, as there are in most countries, the United States being an exception to that. But outside of the country, you would think that they would be looser. But so maybe you could tell us a little bit about the origins of that law or what the thinking is. Is it because that may conflict with, say, the non-interference doctrine, that if you have armed contractors who are going into other countries, that could be construed as interfering in the internal affairs of other countries? Is it because that the Communist Party doesn't like any armed entity, whether it's domestic or abroad? What would be your thinking as to why the Chinese government doesn't want armed forces outside of the country? Again, inside I understand, but outside, even to protect its own people and property.
Oh, let's say this is not quite uncommon or is not a peculiarity of the People's Republic of China. Several countries, starting in Europe, for example, from my country, Italy, they ban national carry weapon or getting engaged in military activity that are not sanctioned by the government. So let's say in this case, having contractors like from United States and so on, is not the norm. If we want to look just at the law, even the Russian Federation forbid for Russian private entity and individual to operate armed outside its own country. That's not the case, but even according to this kind of law, in case you use weapon and you come back, then you can be subject to detention. Then, of course, the principle of non-interference is still there in China international relations. It's one of the 5 pillars of China international relation policy, but it's changing. It's changing very fast, and in the future, I definitely see or foresee some change in the law for the Chinese private security firm operating abroad. This, at the moment, is a vulnus of the Chinese law, because all the Chinese law related to PSC, and I refer to the first one, that is in 1993. So you can see the whole security market inside China is a quite new market compared to the one in the US, in the UK, and so on. This law has been updated in 2010 and is just referred to the operation of Chinese private security company inside China, not outside. So let's say that Beijing is very well aware of the fact that there is need of an update. But then if you are going to have a Blackwater moment, like the Nisur Bloody Sunday, in which Blackwater contractor discharged their weapon on innocent civilian, then if you're going to have a private security firm, basically that is private but still Chinese, with Chinese personnel, killing innocent people, then it will be very difficult to Beijing to still sell the win-win narrative of the Belt and Road Initiative. So I'm sure that up to now, not only from the legal point of view, but from the operational point of view, like NDRC, SASAC, and so on, are looking in depth in how to adapt, modernize, and to engage and shape the Chinese market for force outside China.
It's interesting because you're right. They're in a very difficult position, because if they do have a Blackwater moment, that obviously would have an adverse effect on the perception of the Chinese, which is already fragile in many parts of the world. So that's a limitation. So should we assume then that high-level individuals' facilities are being guarded by Western, international, South African private security forces, since the Chinese do have more limitations on what they can do?
On that, still, it's a matter, in my personal opinion, of capability. One of the set of private security firm, and especially more on private military firm, is the concept of plausible deniability. If something happened, then it's not the state, it's not the country, it's just a private entity. You can just look not long ago when this case was in the Syrian border. More than 200 Russian mercenaries were basically obliterated in a few minutes by US-led bombing. And during that time, there was not an increase of tension between Russia and the United States, because they were not considered enemy combatant, they were not considered Russian soldiers, they were just mercenary at the time. But if we move it back, the narrative, to a Chinese private security firm with Chinese citizen, then I think it would be very, very hard to sell it just as a private entity. And as I mentioned before, I didn't find any kind of confirmation to this, but especially from the West, there is this perception, there is a kind of hidden agenda in some of the Chinese private security firm moving abroad. One of these reasons may be because most of their personnel, basically the ratio is 70-30 from PLA, from PAP, or even from the police. But just because the pool of the person that want to work in this area come from this field, and it always happens in the other private security internationally.
Now, you mentioned that Huaxingdong'an is the only, or one of the few, Chinese private security companies that has been given permission to carry weapons. What kind of weapons would they be carrying? Are these light arms, or are they, again, like the private militaries, they have a range of weapons that are quite sophisticated to protect their assets?
Technically, it's light automatic weapon onto that, but it's strictly controlled. And Hua Xin-Zhong-An with few other, and we are talking, I think, 3 now, Chinese private security firm, they are abiding by an international agreed code of conduct that is ICOCA. ICOCA is based in Geneva. Is supported by several countries, especially by the Swiss government. International Code of Conduct also is supported by the Red Cross. And abiding by this code of conduct, these companies, starting with Hua Xin-Zhong-An, are certified that the use of the weapon, the handling, and all the procedure are done to avoid any kind of damage on the stakeholder abroad and avoiding with this negative spillover. So let's say in order to shape the market for force certification and abiding by this kind of code of conduct is one of the steps that have to be taken. Of course, I'm not so naive to think that only the hidden end of market can play a role into this, but definitely it's a good start. Another very important part is when you choose your subcontractor. So as I mentioned before, a lot of Chinese private security companies use local militia in Africa, and choosing the right subcontractor, the right person in doing the job is one of the most important part, because the wrong person, the wrong tribal affiliation can create huge problem that can reverberate all over the state, African state, and all over the BRI. It happened in the recent past in Afghanistan when there was a choice of a wrong warlord, for example, from some private security firm or private military firm that created more problem than solution to the war effort.
But how would they go about doing that? Because you go into places like the Eastern Congo or South Sudan, and the factional politics are extraordinarily complicated. I mean, this is not something that you can pick up just by showing up on the ground. And who to trust is very difficult as well. You need people who have been there for a long time who will say, you know, this guy, you can trust him. This guy, you can't. So when you talk about how Chinese are subcontracting to local, militias and warlords and whatnot, and I presume in places like the Eastern DRC where the Chinese have very vast mining operations, they must be doing that. Otherwise, they wouldn't be able to continue working. So how, based on your research, do you have any insights on how they go about fielding the various options in order to consider which of the militias and warlords to partner with?
On that, as I mentioned before, for example, ICOCA have a wide range of international company that operated for a long time in Africa, certified by them, and they are trying to matchmaking this company with the requirement of the Chinese company, providing this kind of solution, the one that match the right subcontractor that is not going to create more problem than avoiding already the problem that you find. Of course, as I mentioned before, Africa, more than 50 countries, there are different necessity and security solutions. Like we move from Nigeria, it's in the Delta area, we have maritime insecurity, kidnap and ransom. Kenya, we have a quite diffuse security, but then there is an exponential increase in need for security service for the terrorist threat posed by Al-Shabaab. If we talk about, as you mentioned, South Sudan, South Sahel, or even Central Africa, the ongoing conflict, there is a mix present between private security firm and private military firm. And then there is quite difficult to define which is a private security or a private military. And then if we move to the extreme, to Somalia, then definitely threat from terrorism and warlordism is a very big problem. So in this respect, back to your question, one of the issue is fact that the private security firm, local and international, that work in Africa are not only providing armed security service, but several of high-level one provide intelligence service. What I mean by that, they provide that kind of answer to the question that you mentioned, and they even provide the solution to find the best partner for contracting. One of the biggest problems that the Chinese face to that is not a lack of resource, but is the willingness to pay for the right service. This kind of service don't come cheap. They are quite expensive if you want to train a foreign armed force, and at the same time if you want proper private intelligence. So for the company, especially the SOE, who are already adapted to invest outside and in high-risk area, that's not a big issue. But with the big SOE that for the first time are venturing outside China, then the willingness to pay for this kind of service is very low. They tend just to use more local forces or even just normal Chinese private security company, but this is a recipe for disaster.
Yeah, you would think so, because the Chinese increasingly in South Africa, Kenya, Cameroon, Nigeria, many other places, people have been complaining that they are seen as targets now. That it used to be that if you were white, you were seen as the guy who was going to be shaken down for money. Now, increasingly, it is Chinese. And there's always a suspicion, we don't know for a fact, that every time there's a kidnapping, very soon after the Chinese are released, as it was the case in Osun. Within 3 to 4 days of the kidnapping in Osun just a few weeks ago, they were released. This brings back memories of the French, who oftentimes negotiated from the state to the militias to pay for ransom. Do you have any insight as to whether or not the Chinese pay for ransoms in order to get their hostages back and freed, or how that happens? And that, again, ties to the interaction between the private security contractors who are protecting them and then obviously the state that gets involved to free people if there are incidents like that.
Technically and legally, there is no willingness to pay for ransom and to interact with terrorist and kidnapper. Practically, there are already several Chinese insurance firms that are specializing in the niche market of kidnapping for ransom. The part that is prevent the kidnapping and the part that is negotiating the price, delivery, and the release. This has been done not in a vacuum, it's not done alone by this Chinese insurance and private firm, but it's done in cooperation with international company that already experienced for decades this kind of business inside the market for force. And I'm referring especially a company coming from the United Kingdom. This problem that you mentioned of kidnapping and fast release of Chinese hostages is not only common in several African states, but is increasingly worrisome, getting common along several areas of the BRI and even in South America. In that area, there is a specialization of kidnapping that moved from kidnapping someone for several years and asking very high ransom, as it happened in Venezuela, in Colombia, and now more in area like Brazil, and it's happening in Nigeria at the same time with the same modus operandi, the fact that someone is getting kidnapped and released after even 1 or 2 days for a very limited amount of money, and that's called express kidnapping. Countries like Nigeria are at the helm in statistical term of this kind of activity.
Yeah, this presents a real problem for President Xi Jinping, because going back a couple of years ago, there was a Chinese national who was taken hostage by ISIS and then killed. And I was in China at the time, and it was covered in the beginning, but then people started to get really angry on social media that how come the government isn't doing more to protect Chinese individuals overseas. This happened also in, I think it was South Sudan, or it may have been Sudan, where a group of workers were kidnapped. And there was growing political pressure at home for that China, now being the great country that it says it is, must have the ability to protect its people and its property overseas. This precipitated in part the passage of the, I think, 2015 anti-terrorism law that did allow, or does allow, foreign deployment of Chinese forces into other countries in order to protect people and property. So I'm curious about the politics of kidnapping and how, say, for example, a firm like Huaxin Zhong'an, who is capable of carrying weapons and presumably there to help prevent these kinds of kidnappings, how do they interact with the PLA in order to save people and property overseas so as to prevent the type of political headaches that Xi Jinping doesn't need at home?
Yeah, in this you are correct. I think that what you said about the Chinese citizen that was captured by the self-proclaimed Islamic State and later on allegedly beheaded, all together with another terrorist attack, if I recall correct, was in Bamako, the capital of Mali.
That's right.
Where 3 officials from Chinese construction company, railway company, if I recall correct, were killed by terrorists. That was a defining moment. Why? Because before it was already happening that Chinese worker, engineers especially, were kidnapped, some were killed, but the news was not taking so much traction at home. With the fact that the Chinese perception abroad increased, also there was an increase in perception to the fact that they were becoming valuable target for kidnapping and ransom. The lack of willingness to provide some kind of negotiation of support then fired back at home, especially on the new media, because there is started a movement of kind of Chinese life matters. So in this respect, China since then, and by China I mean Beijing, is more assertive in protecting Chinese citizen abroad. To your question, that is a big question, how private security firms interact with PLA in this regard, and especially after the white paper of the 2015, there is not a law, there is not a procedure that is known up to now. What I can say is that Beijing is working very actively in framing the law that regulate private military and security industry. Is very active on that, especially the integration of security theory and law with the example taken from the past, not only from Africa in the 60s and 90s, but from Iraq and Afghanistan. Of course, it's a different time. For example, in terms of protecting Chinese life, the PLA Navy, with the evacuation of Chinese citizen worker in Libya and more recently in Yemen, already showed a very high level of capability in protecting Chinese life and saving Chinese people abroad. They even saved other foreign nationals. But then now there is a question, how many Chinese nationals you need to save outside in terms to have the chance to call the PLA Navy? And at the time, you still didn't have boot on the ground. You didn't have Chinese soldiers roaming around the countries and so on. It was just on the port activity. So in this respect, the question is 20, 200, 2,000 Chinese citizens that have to be in security problem to be saved for this state intervention. And then how you justify this with the principle of non-interference that is still there. So the relationship between private security, insurance company, PLA is something that is been very actively discussed, and we will see a lot of change in the near future. One of the good change for company, like I mentioned before, not only Huaxin Zhong'an, but other high-level Chinese company, is that now they don't offer only service of guarding, the guard in gated compound. They already provide logistic planning, journey management in high-risk area, armed executive protection, and maritime security in hostile environment. So we already seen an upgrade in terms of training, capability, and personnel.
Should we expect a new law anytime soon, or an update to a new white paper that will help give us an understanding of what direction this industry is going in?
I do believe this is just a personal hunch, but definitely there will be, and there is already a lot of discussion in Beijing about practice, state perspective in terms of how work and develop the private security sector. And this is not done, as I mentioned before, alone, but there are, for example, like ICOCA, the Red Cross and other governments, starting with the Swiss Federation, that are actively involving with China in provide expertise, training and advice that range from law, regulation, and the interaction between military, private military, and the security industry at all.
It's still interesting because for me, the government in many ways has set up an expectation that it is going to play a predominant role. And that comes out of course, Wolf Warrior 2. That was the popular movie from 2017. And I'll never forget the closing shots of that, which was if you recall, the PLA Navy, armada coming in to save Wu Jing and all of the damsel in distress in some ways. But it really did set an expectation in the eyes of many Chinese people that the PLA, both the Navy and ground forces, have the ability and are capable now of doing those kinds of interventions. And there's a political kind of payoff for doing it. I recall here in Vietnam, several years ago, there were anti-Chinese riots and disturbances, and the Chinese sent in buses and planes to get their nationals out. And rather than kind of going in quietly in the middle of the night, which would have been the more discreet way to kind of evacuate their people so that it's just, out of sight, they came in the middle of the day. And the buses went right through the streets of Saigon and right through Hanoi to get their nationals out. And there were CCTV cameras along the way, and it was a propaganda tool as well. And again, it's interesting just to see how all the different dimensions of this overseas security plays together. Propaganda, movie, expectations. Obviously, the private security contractors now are going to factor into that as well. So with all of that in the mix, where do you see this going in the future in the next, say, 12 to 24 months?
Let's say that's I don't have
your crystal ball. You don't have your crystal ball.
Really, really difficult to mention this. Let's say that Wolf Warrior, in practical term, did a lot of damage in terms of over expectation.
Yes, they did.
Most of the Chinese private security company moving abroad, they think about themselves just as the one depicted in the movie Wolf Warrior. And then one thing is the training that you have in China, that is still a very safe country, and there is no need of much guarding and private security. And something that you get when you move in area like Sahel, Somalia, and so on, when you need professional trained people that have been already working in that area and know the local necessity and solution. Let's say in the next 12, 15 months, what I can foresee is the fact that there will be changes in terms of how the training, the interaction with the foreign company in terms of security foreign company will help Chinese company in working abroad. Still, the biggest problem, as I mentioned before, is not finding the right company only, but it find a client that is willing to pay the correct amount of money and value that kind of service. Because like an insurance, if you don't perceive a risk, you are not willing to subscribe to that insurance, and basically you just crossing the finger. Then if you move to some of the construction company that are the one that now carry most of the work on the BRI, then their profit is still very tiny and diluted. So for them, afford a proper security company is quite still a big issue. So basically, one of the trend that I can foresee, a positive one, could be finding a local company that work with a multinational international security company and altogether get up to speed in terms of training and protection, not only of the client, but of the local stakeholders, to avoid the negative spillover that the private security firm can ignite.
Well, there we go. That was awesome. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. I could have gone on for 3 hours on this subject. I love it.
No, thank you for having me.
Oh,
and,
I think it's
to mention in the thank you that I'm really grateful to the China-Africa Research Initiative by John Hopkins SAIS that helped me to do my study on the field in Africa, and especially when I was in Djibouti.
Well, I hope that you come back to talk to us a little bit in the future about some of the research that you're doing in Africa, as you do more of this.
I'm looking forward when there will be the publication of the next book on it, or probably if we have to comment Wolf Warrior 3.
Yes, we'll definitely do Wolf Warrior 3. That will be it, So, well, thank you so much. I appreciate it. Cobus, Dr. Arduino made a very important distinction that I think is lost on a lot of people who are new to this subject. There's a difference between private security and private armies. And what we're talking about with the Chinese here is private security. Private armies are remember those Blackwater guys with the automatic weapons dressed in black, and those are the kind of guys who are in for the Americans in Afghanistan, in Iraq. That's not who we're talking about for the most part for the Chinese in Africa. We're talking about private security. For the most part, they're going to be unarmed. They're doing intelligence. And I thought it was absolutely fascinating what he was talking about, how so much of it is going to be working with local warlords and local stakeholders to find out intelligence of where to go, what to do, in part because the Chinese are heavily invested in places that are highly unstable. Think of the Eastern Congo, Mali, Chad, some of these places where insurgencies and instability are par for the course, and they need people who they can trust. So to me, this is actually not a bad thing. However, Cobus, and this is what I'd like to get your take on, the presence of security under any guise of foreigners engaging in security in Africa has a very loaded history. And, so as the Chinese kind of step up their security presence and it becomes more visible, it could potentially rub people the wrong way.
Yes, it could definitely turn political. And I mean, we have to note that so far China's security work in Africa, the security work run by Chinese state institutions, have not been run by state institutions, to be more exact. It's happened under the auspices of the UN. So generally you don't, for example, see the People's Liberation Army acting as itself in Africa. They usually act as UN troops. So this is
generally we've never seen that happen.
Yes, no,
you're
right.
It's always been under a UN flag.
Exactly. So this is a big shift. And the fact that it's a shift that plays in kind of in the space where multinationals are working and therefore where lots of private security companies are already active doesn't make it any less of a big shift. And as we've seen many times, the Chinese come with a lot of additional political baggage. So having French private security around in West Africa, for example, isn't as notable, won't necessarily draw as much comment as it would be to have Chinese private security. And I think this kind of weird double standard, or the kind of outsized amount of attention that Chinese involvement in Africa draws is its own challenge.
Right. And just to be clear, we may see a greater presence of Chinese private security companies, but we also may see Chinese stakeholders like CNPC, CNOOC, the big oil companies, engage the French, the Israelis, the South Africans, the players who are already in the market. So it may not be that we see a lot of Chinese guys with earpieces and they won't be armed for the most part because, again, it's against Chinese law except for one company. But for the most part, that they might actually just use existing security companies. But there's definitely going to be a greater presence on security because it becomes a political liability, not just to have security forces in Africa, but when Chinese workers are kidnapped back home in China, there's this perception that China is now a great power and it makes China seem weak. And she and the presidency and the administration come under pressure when their workers are taken captive. Can't the government do something to protect our people overseas? And now more and more, a lot of people in big cities know somebody who works in Africa, in South America, somewhere else. So there's a personal connection to the idea of working overseas. And if that's made to feel vulnerable, that would have political ramifications back home.
Yes, this is going to be the big test. It's like when a Chinese citizen gets kidnapped, and all of the interim measures to try and get them back fail. What happens then? Especially considering that Chinese media has already painted a picture of a kind of a strong macho interventionist Chinese force on the coast of Africa, and, for example, in Wolf Warrior 2. So that Wolf Warrior 2 sends a very strong propaganda message. It ends on this image of a Chinese passport. It ends with this kind of like Chiron on screen of essentially people who abuse China's national interests or citizens will be pursued, no matter where they are. So that's a kind of a strong line to draw on the sand, so it's going to be very interesting to see how that actually happens turns out in real life.
And do you remember that closing scene of Wolf Warrior 2 where it was the armada of PLA Navy ships coming in to kind of save the day? And they were not coming in under a UN flag, by the way. They were coming in under a Chinese flag. And that was an interesting kind of contrast. And remember that these movies are done in close cooperation, if not under the direction of the Communist Party and the PLA. This is not a creative license that's being taken like you would see in a Hollywood movie. These are done with strategic thinking and messaging in mind. I spoke with one of Dr. Arduino's colleagues in the security space, and he shared Dr. Arduino's point here that Wolf Warrior 2 really set a false expectation among Chinese constituents on what the capabilities and the ability of the PLA is and what they're willing to do. There is no indication whatsoever that the Chinese are going to send in the Navy to rescue some people. They've never done that, and it's hard to imagine that they would anytime soon. They didn't do it in South Sudan when there were a number of kidnappers. Most of the times, and I spoke with Dr. Arduino about this, when Chinese get kidnapped, they're released pretty quickly. And that happened with the French a lot. And that is an indication that there may be payments that are happening behind the scenes. So rather than send in the PLA, the Chinese send in the bankers. And that's a double-edged sword for the Chinese, because on the one hand, they get their people back. But on the other hand, they might be encouraging more kidnapping because they're paying. And
yes.
They're in a tough spot right now. So I don't think they figured out what they want to do or where they want to go, but this is definitely a space to watch in the future. Certainly there's going to be a greater security presence. You will start to see it in Chinese projects. It'll probably become more visible. I don't think we're going to see, SEAL Team 6, the Chinese equivalent, coming in, hot and heavy with automatic rifles to rescue people. But you never know. You never know. So that'll do it for a wrap on our shows in 2019. This is the last regular show of the year. Show number, can you believe this, Cobus, 440 that we've done.
That's crazy.
440. So next year will be our 10th anniversary. We'll close in on 500 shows. Our next show coming up will be our annual year in review preview. So if you're going to join us next week, that would be great. But we want to thank everybody for a wonderful year of every week a discussion, now sometimes twice a week discussions. Again, if these are things that interest you, the new year would be a great time to sign up for our newsletter. And we have just a great community of people who are in it, from the IMF, the World Bank, the State Department, folks at Johns Hopkins. We just got some folks at JETRO, the Japanese Development Agency. So a great group of people. Ministry of Foreign Affairs in China has signed up for it. Let's see, in VC firms in Nairobi and in Johannesburg are also part of this community. So we would love to have you part of the community. Every single day, Cobus and I are putting out this newsletter. Just go to ChinaAfricaProject.com/subscribe, and you'll have access to our site, the China Africa Experts Network, and of course, getting our daily newsletter. So for Cobus Van Staden in Johannesburg, I'm Eric Olander. Thank you so much for listening.
The discussion continues online. Head over to facebook.com/China Africa Project to share your thoughts on today's show. The guys are also on Twitter, where you can find Kobus at Stadinsky or Eric at E. Olander. And be sure to sign up for the weekly China in Africa email newsletter by going to www.ChinaAfricaProject.com.